I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for taking the time to join our webinar today. My name is Aarti Bhatia, and I am a head and neck medical oncologist here at Yale. I've been here since 2015, and I lead the clinical research team for head and neck, endocrine, and sarcoma trials. And I'm joined on today's webinar by Dr. Deshpande, who leads patient care and research efforts in sarcoma and endocrine trials at Yale, and Kwasi Boateng, who was our research team's clinical research manager for several years, and only recently moved to the GI oncology team. So the purpose of today's webinar is to highlight the currently active clinical trial portfolio for head and neck, endocrine cancers, and sarcoma, and to review upcoming trials that are currently in the pipeline for activation. We will be breaking up today's session into 3 segments. So I will be reviewing first the head and neck trial portfolio. Then Kwasi is going to be discussing the process to refer patients for trials at Yale. And last but not the least, Dr. Deshpande will review the endocrine and sarcoma trial menu. Just a couple housekeeping issues. Please post any questions that come up during the session today into the Q&A box, which you see on the bottom bar of the Zoom session. I think your microphones are going to be muted throughout the session, so that might be the best way to post any questions, any concerns, and we will review those questions and queries at the end. So I am going to be sharing my screen. Okay. All right, so I'll start by reviewing the head and neck trial portfolio here. I have no disclosures for today's talk. This is a picture of our entire team. I think we may be missing a couple newer members of our team from our surgical team that have recently joined. But we are a big team of medical radiation and surgical oncologists that participate in clinical care of patients with head and neck cancers at Yale. We are a very multidisciplinary team, so we're supported in our practice by dietitians, speech and swallow therapists, physical therapists. I see some of those on the attendance session today. Thank you for taking care of our patients. And we actively all support our patients through their treatment and accrue them to clinical trials when appropriate. So this is a very broad overview of, just a very high-level review of all the trials that we have here. We have trials that are specific to different disease phases of our patients' cancer stages. So we have trials that involve treatment in the neoadjuvant phase of treatment, so prior to any surgery or radiation. Trials catering to patients with locally advanced disease, so those that are designed to improve on definitive curative approaches or adjuvant curative approaches. We have trials that try to improve on current surgical practices and outcomes, and of course trials that involve patients who have recurrent and metastatic disease that's not curable, and these are categorized by first line, second line, and beyond. In the pipeline, we also have trials that are specific for HPV positive and negative subset patients. And then we also have clinical trials that are designed for patients with locally advanced skin cancers. Those primarily occur in the head and neck. So a lot of the head and neck skin cancers, squamous cell cancers, are treated within our team. And we have a couple trials that I'll be going over that for those patients particularly. We also have very exciting antibody drug conjugates, which is really sort of the new thing, upcoming theme in patients with solid tumors that we will be opening at Yale that are in our pipeline. And I'll be going over those as well. So I will be getting into each one of these studies with some details. And then Dr. Deshpande will cover the sarcoma and head and neck trials that are outlined here. Okay, so our first trial that we're going to overview is our window trial, so a neoadjuvant trial of 5-azacitidine or nivolumab, or the combination of the two drugs in patients who have HPV-associated squamous cell cancers of the head and neck. This is an investigator-initiated trial at Yale, and it builds on a previous trial of 5-aza monotherapy that showed some clinical activity and success in HPV-driven head and neck cancers. The trial is currently active at the New Haven site as well as in Waterford and Trumbull. Those are pending, but will be opening shortly. Our current accrual stands at 3, maybe a 4th patient coming on soon. And our target accrual is 51 patients. And this trial was just activated a few months ago. So this is the study schema. Patients who have HPV-associated cancer, and we'll get into the eligibility in the next slide, will be randomized into one of 3 arms if they are believed to be surgically resectable. So they have to be eligible for transoral robotic surgery. And they'll be randomized into one of 3 treatment arms. So they either get 5-aza monotherapy, they get treated with 5-aza on days 1 through 5, and then surgery is planned on days 16, 17, or 18. Or they could get nivolumab monotherapy. Treatment will be every 2 weeks, so they get 2 doses on day 1 and day 15. And then again, surgery on days 16, 17, or 18. Or they get arm C, which is a combination of the 2 drugs. So 5-aza is given on days 1 through 5, and nivolumab is given on days 2 and 16, with surgery being planned on days 17 or 18. The post-op course is pretty standard. They get discharged and they do have some safety follow-ups afterwards, but it's really quite a minimal burden on patients with this study. So patients have to have resectable and cytologically confirmed squamous cell carcinoma of the oropharynx. It can be T1 to T3 and 0 to 2, no distant metastases, and has to be resectable by one of our head and neck surgeons by TORS. Biopsies are required prior to treatment start on the trial. So in addition to diagnostic biopsies, we do need research biopsies. So that's something we have to let patients know. They'll be going through a second biopsy. This could be in clinic or it would need to be in the OR. And it needs to be from the primary tumor site, not from neck nodes. HPV association needs to be confirmed. We typically do that with the P16 IHC assay. And we define P16 positivity by staining in over 70% of tumor cells. And patients, of course, have to be adults. The second trial is an ECOG study 3161, which is a phase 3 randomized trial of maintenance nivolumab versus observation in patients who have locally advanced, intermediate, or high-risk HPV-associated oropharynx cancers. This study has been active since about 2019. Yale is one of the leading accruing sites across the country. We have put about 38 patients on this study, and the study is open in New Haven, Trumbull, Waterford, and Greenwich. This is the study schema. So patients have to have, again, HPV-associated disease, which is measured by P16 on immunohistochemistry staining. If they're smokers, so eligibility is really classified based on their smoking status. So if they have a greater than 10-pack-year smoking history, they could have T1 to 2 bilateral neck disease or more bulky neck disease, or T3 to 4 with even N0 disease, N0 to 3. Or if they're less than 10-pack-year smokers, then they have to have either T4 primary or bilateral neck disease to be eligible at a minimum. And patients are stratified by their smoking status, a nodal stage and T stage. They get the standard chemotherapy and radiation for 7 weeks, which is the same on or off trial. But following completion of definitive chemo and radiation, they're either getting nivolumab Q4 weeks for a whole year or observation. And the randomization happens prior to start of chemo radiation. So going into chemo radiation, patients know what they're going to be getting afterwards. There is long-term follow-up on the study. and their crossover is allowed as well. So if patients do progress on arm B and are not resectable or have distant disease, they are allowed to cross over to nivolumab at progression. So again, this is the eligibility criteria, HPV positive oropharynx cancer. These are the stages that are permitted. Patients should be newly diagnosed and should not have had prior systemic therapy or radiation treatment, and no distant disease is allowed. So it's for locally advanced disease. The next trial is RTOG 1216, which is a randomized phase 2/3 trial. I think we're in the phase 3 now, of surgery and post-op radiation given with concurrent cisplatin versus docetaxel and cetuximab versus atezolizumab and cisplatin for high-risk squamous cell cancers of the head and neck. This study is open at New Haven and Waterford, and Yale has currently put on 14 patients on this study. So this is the study design. It's for patients who have high-risk disease and have had surgery as their initial treatment. They could have a primary tumor site in the oral cavity, larynx, hypopharynx, or P16 negative oropharynx. So P16 positive patients are not permitted on this study. They should have high-risk features on pathology, so either a positive margin or extracapsular extension. And they're randomized in a I think it's 2:1:1. So 50% of patients get arm 4, which is RT plus cisplatin plus atezolizumab, and 25% of patients each get either radiation plus cisplatin or radiation plus docetaxel and cetuximab. So again, for eligibility, P16 negative disease, any head and neck tumor site is permitted as long as they had surgery first, should have had gross total surgical resection and at least one high-risk pathologic feature, either extracapsular extension or a positive surgical resection margin. And the hope is that one of the other systemic therapy arms will be superior to cisplatin alone, which is the current standard of care. The next trial is also an ECOG study. It's 3132. Sorry about that. So this one is a phase 2 randomized study of adjuvant radiation with or without cisplatin for surgically resected squamous cell cancers of the head and neck. Yale has put on 15 patients on this trial. It's been open for a few years now. And the treatment locations are New Haven, Trumbull, Guilford, Westerly, Greenwich, and Waterford. And this is the study schema. So this study enrolls patients with what we call intermediate risk squamous cell cancers of the head and neck. These patients should have had surgery first. They do not have the high-risk pathologic features, so they don't have positive margins or extracapsular extension, but they could have any one of the many criteria that buys them adjuvant radiation. So that is patients who have stage 3 or 4 disease with lymphovascular invasion, perineural invasion, closed margins, multiple lymph nodes involved. So any criteria that buys them adjuvant radiation. And these patients have their tumor tissue submitted to Foundation 1 for tumor profiling. The purpose of that is to assess if these patients have a disruptive TP53 mutation, because retrospective research has shown that TP53 mutated patients tend to benefit as an independent factor from the addition of chemotherapy to radiation. So we stratify by TP53, but we don't have to have a disruptive mutation to be eligible for this study. It is important to note that the tissue for submission to Foundation 1 should ideally happen as soon as after surgery as possible, because that does take a couple weeks to result. So to avoid delaying start of adjuvant treatment and avoid missing the window to enroll, because the whole goal is to start adjuvant RT within 6 to 7 weeks. So in order to meet that goal, we do want to send the tissue out even when the patient's in the hospital, so as soon as the pathology results. And these patients are randomized to either radiation alone, which is the standard 60 gray IMRT, or arm B, which is radiation plus weekly cisplatin for 6 doses. So again, this is the eligibility criteria. They should have a curatively treated head and neck cancer, must be disease-free. Oh, I'm sorry, that's other cancers. But registration has to happen within 8 weeks post total resection of the tumor. If they have oropharyngeal cancers, they have to be HPV negative. And they should have a pathologically proven squamous cell cancer that's completely resected and has a stage of stage 3, T3 to T4A, and 0 to 3, or T1 to T2 and 1 to 3. So essentially stage 3 to 4A. The next study is Keynote 630. It's a Merck trial for patients with locally advanced squamous cell carcinomas of the skin. This study has also been open since 2019, currently open at New Haven and Trumbull sites. And we have put 5 patients on this trial. So this is for patients who have high risk locally advanced disease of the skin that's completely resected. Patients do get randomized 1:1 after surgery and after any adjuvant radiation to either pembrolizumab Q6 weeks or placebo. It's a double-blinded study, so we don't know what the patients are getting, and treatment is Q6 weeks for 1 year. To be eligible, patients should have a cutaneous squamous cell cancer. Many of these are from the head and neck, but it's okay to have it at any body site. The high-risk features that make patients eligible for this study is either extracapsular extension or cortical bone invasion, or 2 or more of these factors. So tumors that are over 4 centimeters in size, have multifocal PNI, are poorly differentiated, if this is recurrent disease or if this is in transit metastases. So having any 2 of these other features will make patients eligible for the trial. They should have undergone complete resection of all gross disease, with or without microscopic positive margins, and should have completed adjuvant radiation for locally advanced disease. Patients are enrolled 4 to 16 weeks after completion of radiation. So there is a broad window for patients to have recovered from their radiation treatment and to start treatment on this trial. Patients are also permitted to have received chemotherapy in combination with radiation as adjuvant treatment. The next study is HN006, which is an NRG trial and only recently activated at Yale. We just put our first patient on this study, and the active sites are New Haven and Trumbull. This is a study assessing quality of life and survival outcomes for patients who have early stage oral cavity cancer, so T1 to T2, without nodal disease. And these patients get randomized to arm 1, which is sentinel node biopsy, or arm 2, which is elective neck dissection. So this is a debate that's been going on for a while, and this is a prospective trial to try and address that question of whether sentinel node biopsy improves quality of life without affecting the survival outcomes compared to elective neck dissection for patients with early stage oral cavity cancers. So upon being screened and registered, they do undergo a PET scan to ensure there's no nodal disease. For patients who have nodal disease, they're not eligible for the study. If the PET-CT is negative for nodal disease, they're stratified by T-stage and performance status and randomized to one of the 2 arms. For patients who have positive sentinel lymph nodes, they do go on to get a completion neck dissection. So the eligibility is pathologically proven diagnosis of squamous cell cancer of the oral cavity. They should have T1 or T2 disease, no nodal disease, and be a candidate for surgery with either sentinel node and potential completion neck dissection or an elective neck dissection. And like we talked about, the PET-CT has to be negative for nodal involvement. EA 3191 is a randomized trial of adjuvant therapy for patients who have either recurrent or second primary cancers of the head and neck. These patients should have previously received radiation for their initial primary tumor and have now undergone surgery as salvage cure for either a recurrent or a second primary tumor. The study is active since last year. We have put one patient on, and it's open at New Haven, Waterford, and Trumbull. And this is the schema. The study was recently amended. So it was randomization to 3 treatment arms, but now it's just to 2 treatment arms. So these patients have locally recurrent or second primary head and neck cancers that have been surgically resected and have high-risk features. So high-risk features are defined as a positive margin or extranodal extension. And they're randomized 1:1 to either re-radiation with cisplatin or carboplatin per investigator's choice, or pembrolizumab monotherapy, Q6 weeks for 9 cycles. And this is the eligibility like we talked about. So they should have undergone surgery and be randomized within 8 weeks of surgery. So that's the window post-op. And they should have a positive margin or ENE. Any prior radiation should have been completed at least 6 months prior to randomization on this study. And patients should have PD-L1 positive disease. We measure that with a CPS or combined positive score greater than 1. Coming to our recurrent and metastatic disease trials. So this is the BURAN trial of buparlisib, which is a PI3 kinase inhibitor in combination with paclitaxel, compared to paclitaxel alone in patients with recurrent and metastatic disease. This trial has also been open since last year. We've put 2 patients on. And this is the study schema. So patients who are eligible, and we'll come to that on the next slide, will be randomized in a 2:1 fashion to either buparlisib plus paclitaxel or paclitaxel alone. This study is built on results from an older phase 2 trial, which was published in 2017, which showed improvement in progression-free survival for patients who received combination of a PI3 kinase inhibitor with paclitaxel compared to paclitaxel alone. So we do know that the study is, which is why the randomization leans in favor of the combination, because we do think the regimen is active, but that was a smaller study. So patients should have histologically confirmed head and neck squamous cell cancers, either progressive or recurrent disease after treatment with a checkpoint inhibitor and platinum. So patients have to have received both those drugs. They could have received it simultaneously as a combination regimen or sequentially, either anti-PD-1 first, followed by platinum later, or vice versa. And no more than 2 lines of treatment are allowed. This is our in-house IIT. It's a cetuximab afatinib combination phase 2 trial. We have this open since a few years now, and it's almost getting close to completing enrollment. So our target enrollment was 50 patients. We have put 46 patients on, and it's open at several sites across Connecticut. And this, I'm sorry, there's no schema, but it's basically a combination of cetuximab and afatinib. So the afatinib is an oral EGFR kinase inhibitor, and cetuximab is a monoclonal antibody that's given intravenously. It also targets EGFR, so they both have the same target, but the combination is believed to overcome some of the resistance mechanisms to cetuximab monotherapy. And truly, in combination, the 2 drugs have shown a better response rate that we would expect to see historically with cetuximab monotherapy. And we have some patients who've been on this trial we have one that's been on this trial for 5 years now. So key eligibility, patients should have histologically confirmed squamous cell cancer of the head and neck that's either metastatic, recurrent, and not treatable with curative intent. Should have received previous treatment with either platinum or immune checkpoint inhibitor or both. Patients who have progressed within 6 months of definitive chemoradiation where platinum was used will be eligible. And prior cetuximab is permitted if it was given as curative intent treatment as either induction or definitive with radiation, but not if it was given in the recurrent metastatic setting. EA3202 is also an ECOG trial that Yale leads nationally. We activated this late last year. It's open across several of the network satellite centers. And this is the study schema. So it's a phase 2 leading into a phase 3 trial. We're currently accruing to the phase 2 part of the study. This is for patients who have recurrent metastatic disease and have previously received and progressed on anti-PD-1 therapy. They get randomized to one of 3 treatment arms. Arm A is the current standard of care, which is a platinum doublet plus cetuximab, followed by cetuximab maintenance after 6 cycles of chemotherapy. Arm B is chemotherapy plus bevacizumab. And after 6 cycles of this combination, they receive bevacizumab maintenance. And arm C is atezolizumab and bevacizumab. So bevacizumab is an anti-VEGF inhibitor, and VEGF is believed to exert an immunosuppressive effect in the tumor microenvironment. So the goal of this study is to see if we can reverse resistance to immunotherapy using an anti-VEGF inhibitor. And this just goes over the key eligibility criteria, which have actually just been recently amended in a protocol amendment. So patients should have received, most importantly, prior anti-PD-1 therapy and should not have hyperprogressed on it, should not have bleeding issues from their tumors because anti-VEGF can exacerbate that, and should not have received chemotherapy within the past 4 months. And they must have PD-L1 positive disease measured by CPS. This is a study that was open as a first line for patients with recurrent metastatic disease. It is only very recently suspended to accrual because it's undergoing changes, but will be reopened shortly. So this is a phase 1b/2 study combination of papinimab and pembrolizumab in patients with recurrent metastatic squamous cell cancers. Papinimab is a SEMA4D inhibitor, which acts like the protein acts like a gatekeeper to tumor infiltrating cells in the T infiltrating cells, lymphocytes in the tumor microenvironment. So papinimab blocks the gatekeeper effect of SEMA4D, allowing for greater T cell infiltration. So there was a safety run-in phase, following which the phase 2 enrolled 60 patients and is now closed for protocol amendment. And then I'm going to just briefly go over all the new studies that are pending activation, getting close to activation, and are in our pipeline. So this is a BioNTech study using the BNT11301 drug. It's a phase 2 randomized trial of BNT113 in combination with pembrolizumab versus pembrolizumab monotherapy. And it's a first-line treatment in patients with recurrent metastatic HPV positive disease, so HPV16 positive. We expect it to be activated hopefully no later than a month. And the primary objectives are to demonstrate the superiority of BNT113 in combination with pembrolizumab compared to pembro monotherapy, which is the current standard of care. BNT113 is an HPV E6, E7 specific mRNA vaccine. So the hope is that the vaccine in combination with immunotherapy will help improve response to treatment. And this is the study schema. The safety run-in part is completed, and the results were actually reported at ESMO, the Immuno-Oncology Conference, late last year. That established the safety of the combination. And what we're going to be opening now is the randomized phase, which is part B, and patients will be randomized 1:1 to either pembrolizumab monotherapy or the combination with the HPV vaccine. This is a Torigen study in patients with HPV associated recurrent metastatic disease. This will also hopefully be activated by the end of the year. This drug specifically targets the E5 oncoprotein of HPV16, which is believed to help with the virus latency and persistence in cells. This is a dose escalation type of study, so a standard 3+3 dose escalation pattern. And once the recommended phase 2 dose is established, I believe there is a combination cohort with pembrolizumab that will be opening as well. So inclusion criteria is HPV-associated squamous cell cancers, which have previously been treated with standard immune checkpoint inhibition. So there is the dose escalation phase like we talked about, and then the expansion phase, patients who have failed prior immune checkpoint inhibition and are candidates for additional anti-PD-1 therapy, which is given in combination with the study drug. This is the SEAGEN trial. It's a phase 2 study of tisotumab vedotin for locally advanced or metastatic head and neck cancers. So this study was initially designed for all solid tumors, but the cohorts that we would be enrolling to would be head and neck squamous cell cancer. And so this drug is an anti-tissue factor antibody drug conjugate. So it binds to the tissue factor on the cancer cells and then releases the payload, which is monomethyl auristatin, which is an anti-tubule microtubule inhibitor. And these are the cohorts that we will be enrolling to. So it can be first-line treatment in combination with pembro or pembro plus chemo, or second-line and beyond as monotherapy. The drug is infused every 2 weeks, and they had phase 1 results that were reported at AACR this year, and it showed a response rate of 40% in patients who were heavily pretreated. So that is very exciting early data, and we are pretty excited about this trial. So inclusion criteria are patients with recurrent metastatic disease that has progressed on previous anti-cancer therapy. So patients should have received platinum-based and anti-PD-1 therapy, again, either sequentially or in combination, and no more than 2 lines of prior treatment. This is the IO Biotech neoadjuvant trial that we will be prioritizing for patients with HPV negative disease, since we have the neoadjuvant trials for HPV positive disease currently ongoing. Yale will be leading this study for the head and neck cohort nationally. And we expect to open this study pretty soon as well. So this is a multi-center, multi-cohort study that's studying IO-102, 103 in combination with pembrolizumab. The drug is given both neoadjuvant and again after surgery and radiation if radiation is needed. This is an IDO inhibitor, so the hypothesis is that it'll help overcome the immunosuppressive effects in the tumor microenvironment and help improve response to pembrolizumab, which as a single agent has shown some activity in the neoadjuvant setting for HPV negative disease. So the study will be opening cohorts in head and neck and melanoma, and we will be participating in the head and neck cohort. Patients in the neoadjuvant phase will receive 2 to 3 cycles of the 3 drugs, so of the 2 drugs, so pembrolizumab and the IDO inhibitor. Surgery will be performed 1 to 3 weeks after the last neoadjuvant dose. And after recovery from surgery and any risk-stratified adjuvant therapy, within 12 weeks, patients will continue to receive the adjuvant course of the study drugs for a total of 15 cycles. So this is the study design. Patients with resectable disease in head and neck cancers get 2 to 3 cycles of neoadjuvant treatment. Each cycle is 3 weeks long, and get surgery afterwards. The primary endpoint is major pathologic response at the time of surgery, and then post-op continue for 15 more cycles of the study drug. This is our second line or third line and beyond study using the anti-Claudin-1 antibody as a single agent in dose escalation and in combination with pembrolizumab in patients with recurrent or metastatic head and neck cancer. This is a very exciting drug because in gastric cancer, a similar antibody from the same manufacturer has improved progression-free and overall survival, and is with the FDA now for approval, which we expect sometime this year. So we're very excited about this study in head and neck cancers. So this will study the drug in a dose escalation fashion like we talked about, and then dose expansion in combination with pembrolizumab as well as in monotherapy. This just goes over the same thing. So this is the schema. There's a dose escalation of the drug as a monotherapy and in combination with Keytruda. And then in the dose expansion phase 2, there are 2 doses of the study drug alone that'll be explored. And then there is also a secondary phase 2 study looking at combination of the study drug with Keytruda versus Keytruda alone. And to be eligible, patients should have Claudin-1 expression on their tumor cells. This is a novel neoadjuvant trial that we will be opening in patients with cutaneous squamous cell cancers. So this is a double-blind study that looks at, this is the study schema. So this looks at patients who have resectable cutaneous squamous cell cancers, stage 2 to 4 without distant metastases. They are randomized in a 1:1 fashion to either pembrolizumab monotherapy or pembrolizumab plus a LAG-3 inhibitor. So we already know that neoadjuvant anti-PD-1 therapy elicits major pathologic responses of 60 to 65% in patients with cutaneous squamous cell cancers. This builds on that by adding a LAG-3 inhibitor to pembrolizumab. The combination has been very successful in melanomas. It's an FDA-approved treatment there. And the hope is that because skin cancers in general are very responsive to checkpoint inhibitors, that we would expect to see an improvement in response rate, even for patients with cutaneous squamous cell cancers. So after 3 cycles of neoadjuvant therapy, patients get surgery followed by radiation if needed, an additional 14 cycles of adjuvant therapy. And the primary objective is to evaluate, again, the pathologic complete response on the pembrolizumab and on the combination arm. And that's the end of my segment. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. I am going to stop sharing, and I'll let Kwasi take the lead from here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhatia. Please let me know if you're able to see my screen. Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna just go over a little bit about how you can refer patients through to us and what goes on in the background for most of our clinical research patients. So I have a couple of discussion points here, and we're going to be talking about, who the clinical trial operations team is, what we do, where to find us. We're going to go over where our patients are coming from, where to find our studies, and what to do when you have a potential study patient. And then we'll just discuss a little bit about why we believe your support is really important to help us get patients on these trials. So the Clinical Trials Operations Office is a division of the Yale Comprehensive Cancer Center, and we're dedicated to the management of clinical trials. We support our clinical investigators to ensure the trials that are run within the Yale network are run per regulations and managed properly. So the CTO is made up of several clinical research teams. Previously, these were referred to as the disease-aligned research teams, but these have been changed now. And we have obviously the head and neck and sarcoma and endocrine team, with the pediatrics team, with the lung, breast, neuro-oncology, GI, phase 1, with the hemonc team. And then we have a couple of team members who also support to ensure that the trials are run smoothly as well. With our network centers, there's the care center research teams who are located in different areas in Connecticut. We'll go over those sites. And then we have our clinical research lab support team, and then our clinical tissue services team. The Clinical Trial Operations Office also works with several collaborating departments. So we have the pharmacy, we have the nursing staff, And then we have the Office of Sponsored Projects, through whom we work to ensure that studies are started properly. And then a couple of other collaborating departments within the Yale University organization as a whole. So we have here the contact information for our head and neck team. So we have Dr. Bhatia's phone number and email address. We have Dr. Deshpande, and then we have the core clinical research staff office team. So as Dr. Bhatia mentioned, I was the manager previously, but I've moved now to the GI team. And Sharon Huey is now the clinical research manager for the team. We have our clinical research project manager who helps us ensure that study startup is managed properly. She's called Stacy Severin. And then we have our clinical research coordinator, Anna Wu, clinical research nurse, Jenny Remeta, and then our clinical research data coordinator, who's at the base of it all and helps ensure that data is collected properly for our studies, Catherine Rasico. So I put this network, sorry about that, going back here, put this network image here to show what happens in the background with clinical trials. So at the core of it all, the clinical trial operations team are involved in ensuring that studies that are coming in or initiated by our investigators are started properly. And that means a number of things. It means that we've met all the regulations. The individuals who need regulatory requirements have completed those. We've gone through contracts to ensure that contracts are properly established before the research can proceed. We go through feasibility to ensure that we do have the tools and necessary equipment to partake in the study. And then when we move from study startup, we go to study management, where we're working with the IRB to ensure that the study is managed according to the Code of Federal Regulations. So there is DSMC reviews that happens. There are PRC reviews that happens, and then there are other maintenances of the study, including continuing reviews of our studies. And then we also have subject management, where we have our clinical research coordinators and our clinical research nurses at the core of that. They are ensuring that patients are registered properly. They're ensuring that patients are being followed according to what's indicated in the study protocol. If there are any changes, they're ensuring that our investigators are notified and aware of that, ensuring that the patients are notified and aware of that. Ensuring that patients are scheduled properly according to study requirement. So these all go hand in hand in the background, and we do all of this to support our principal investigators and our clinical research team in the clinic. So I'd mentioned previously that I was going to go over the sites that are involved with our clinical research trials. So we have most of our studies initiated from New Haven, but we do have our network sites, that is Greenwich, Longridge and Stamford, Trumbull and Fairfield, Derby, Torrington, Waterbury, St. Francis, North Haven, Hamden, which I have here on hold because the site is currently closed for some renovations for the radiation oncology department. And then Guildford, Waterford, and Wesley. So we have most of our trials, as you saw during Dr. Bhatia's presentation, active and accruing at these sites. So you're able to refer patients to investigators at these sites. So where are most of our patients coming from? So our patients are usually coming from the Yale New Haven Health System. So we have different collaborating departments, as Dr. Bhatia had showed. We work as a multi-specialty unit. We have our head and neck surgeons. We have our medical oncologists. We have the radiation oncologists. And even with the Sarcoma and Endocrine team, we have surgical oncologists involved as well. And then we have community partnerships. So we have about 30 different, more than 30 community-based organizations that are involved in helping with our clinical research accruals. We have churches also involved in helping with our clinical research accruals. And then we also have federally qualified health systems, federally qualified health centers who are also involved and are able to refer to our networks. And then we have collaborations with our VA, where we also have a couple of patients who are coming through there. And in certain cases, we have studies that are actually activated there in collaboration with them. And obviously, we also have different individuals from all over the nation and all over the world who are sometimes interested and reach out about participating in our studies. So you can find most of our studies through our website. We'll make sure that that's provided for you. And then if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, we have all our studies listed there as well. Those are usually found using an NCT number, which you can obtain. And then you can contact any of our investigators, Dr. Bhatia or Dr. Deshpande, and we can provide you with the most recent list of the trials. So when you do have a patient, the most important thing would be to notify the oncologist, the investigator, to make them aware that you have a potential that you would like to refer to them. So the patients who are within our Yale network have records that are accessible to us. So through our early IRB approvals, we are able to review and pre-screen these patients who are within our network. So if you have a patient who is already in our network, we can, the research team, after notification from the investigator, can go in and then pre-screen the patient to confirm if the patient will meet the study criteria. Patients who are not within the Yale network will be contacted by the new patient coordinator. So after you've informed the investigator about this, the new patient coordinator would work with your clinic to ensure that records are transferred properly. And then the patient will then be scheduled to come in for a visit or a consult with the investigator. If patients are confirmed to have passed pre-screen through the key criteria of the study, we usually have a consult where we go through the informed consent process, where our clinical research nurses work alongside clinical research nurses and clinical research coordinators work alongside our investigators, sub-investigator, principal investigators, to review thoroughly the study protocol with the patient. We give them a copy of the consent. Some patients prefer to take it home and think about it and come back. Others do review and then agree to proceed since they've already received information. And then we go through the study required eligibility evaluations for the patient, and then we create a research plan, including when the patient has to start, if there are timelines that are required per protocol, and then we proceed to have the patient enrolled once that's completed. So we added this last portion here to indicate, that really with clinical research, our base of support is patient accruals, because without patient accruals, we really wouldn't be able to get the data we need to ensure continuity, and improvement in patient care. So recruitment and retention is really important because it helps answer, the research questions that are posed, many of which was discussed in Dr. Bhatia's presentation and will be discussed with Dr. Deshpande as well. So no patient or hydration means we don't get any data, and there are no changes that we can make. We stick with the status quo. However, with your support, if you identify potential patients that you believe will meet our these studies or these treatment options that we have available for them, when they do come to us, there is a team that is involved in most of these clinical trials to ensure that everything is QA'd. Sometimes we have situations where we're collecting data, sending it to experts in various fields to review the data before the patients are enrolled on the studies. And then in addition to providing different options for these patients, the patients will have participation of clinical trial closer to home. Most of our studies are open, as we spoke about earlier, in Trumbull and Waterford, different of these network centers where patients can be enrolled and then receive care right at where they live. Okay, so this comes to the end of my presentation, and thank you again so much for joining this talk.
Thank you, Kwasi. That was excellent. Dr. Deshpande, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And I just want to say how impressed I am with the head and neck team's studies. I mean, that's a really impressive portfolio. And hopefully we'll get there with the endocrine sarcoma studies as well. So I'm going to go through our studies in the endocrine sarcoma team. There was a question about thyroid and adrenal cancers. We're currently in between studies for those. I'm going to focus on the sarcoma studies. The first one is a phase 2 trial that we have open here. It's currently actually on hold. The accrual target was just met. And this is looking at atezolizumab and immunotherapy against alveolar soft part sarcomas. It's a study run through the National Cancer Institute through Pat LaRusso's UM1 grant. So a very exciting study for Yale to open. And even more exciting is that it is now completed accrual and we have results for it. This was the study schema. The atezolizumab is given every 3 weeks for these patients. These patients can be seen from the age of 2 upwards. So this was open in the pediatrics group as well as in the adult group. And the patient we had on study was actually one of our pediatrics patients. The adults were allowed to get atezolizumab, and then if they progressed, they would get atezolizumab plus bevacizumab. This arm with bevacizumab was not open for patients under the age of 18. The primary objectives were to look at the overall response rate using RECIST. And these were the results. So it's already been published. 52 patients were evaluated, and the overall response was, objective responses were seen in 19 out of 52 patients, or 37%, with 1 complete response and 18 partial response. It was published in the New England Journal, and the FDA approved the drug for alveolar soft part sarcoma in December 2022. This is the first immunotherapy to be approved for sarcoma patients. So a very exciting study to be involved in. We also have this study open. This is for leiomyosarcoma patients. Sarcomas, we split into soft tissue and bone. Both the alveolar soft part sarcomas and leiomyosarcomas are considered soft tissue sarcomas. And this study is open for patients who have either unresectable, metastatic, refractory, or relapsed leiomyosarcomas. We've currently got 2 patients on at Yale, and hopefully we'll be getting a lot more if we get more referrals. Patients are randomized 2-to-1 to get dacarbazine plus this new compound. It's a new tubulin agent, unesbulin, which is an oral tubulin agent, which has very little neurotoxicity, or dacarbazine alone with placebo. Patients have to have leiomyosarcoma, and they have to have measurable disease as well as disease progression. The primary objective is to look at the progression-free survival, and there are multiple secondary and exploratory objectives as well. So we do have a lot of trials that we're hoping to open, and these are some of them that are close to activation. The first one is a trial that I'm quite excited about. This is because of my interest in desmoid tumors. This is using a new MEK inhibitor, REC 4881, in patients with familial adenomatous polyposis. It's split into two parts. The first part is a single and multiple dose PK study, and the second part is a randomized placebo-controlled study. The idea of this study is to look at patients who have FAP, who've had a colectomy, but who have polyps that can be followed, and then see what the outcome is after getting the study drug. The part one is the safety trial, and they're going to have patients who get 4 milligrams as a single or multiple dose. And in the secondary part, they're looking at the safety and tolerability of the drug compared to placebo. And then in part two, the patients get 6 months of daily dosing and looking at outcomes of polyp burden and also progression of desmoid tumors. This is the study schema, as I mentioned on the other slides. These are the drugs that are being used. The REC 4881 is an oral capsule, and there's a matching placebo. The DCI 2618 study is looking at a different tumor, gastrointestinal stromal tumor, or GIST. And this is a very specific study. So what we know about GIST is that most patients will respond to imatinib. In the second line treatment, a medication called ripretinib, which has been approved for the fourth line treatment of this medication, looked so good in the fourth line that it was tested against the existing second line treatment, sunitinib, in patients who had failed imatinib. And everyone was very excited about that trial, but it ended up being a negative trial. The patients did not do better with ripretinib. But when they looked more carefully at those patients, they realized that patients who had a exon 11 KIT mutation with a co-occurring exon 17 and 18 mutation did much better with ripretinib than with sunitinib. So this study is trying to just identify those patients and see whether this medication really is beneficial for them in the second line. It's looking for 54 patients nationwide. So we're hoping to get a couple of patients on this trial because we do see a fair number of GIST patients here, but we do need the cooperation of everyone in all the care centers involved in seeing these patients. It's a phase 3, 2-arm randomized open label global multi-center trial, as I mentioned, comparing ripretinib to sunitinib in this very niche population of patients who have a KIT exon 11 and 17 or 18 mutation. They cannot have exon 9, 13, or 14 mutation because those patients are more sensitive to sunitinib. Patients will be pre-screened using circulating tumor DNA. In Dr. Bhatia's trial, they were using Foundation 1. In this trial, they're going to use Guardant. And patients will be randomized to get one or the other drug. The primary objective is to compare the efficacy based on progression-free survival on an independent radiological review. This is the study schema. Once again, they have to have this KIT exon 11 mutation. This is extremely important. It's a very small study, and they really don't want contamination with patients who do not meet the criteria. Patients are allowed to cross over from sunitinib to ripretinib, so this should entice more patients to sign up for this study. This is the trial treatment. The ripretinib is 150 milligrams. That's 3 50 milligram pills continuously, whereas the sunitinib is given on the standard dose, which is 50 milligrams a day, given for 4 weeks and then a 2-week break. The STRAS-2 trial is the last trial I'll talk about, and this is another trial I'm really excited about. It's to answer a question that has been posed for many, many years now, whether neoadjuvant chemotherapy makes a difference in the treatment of patients with retroperitoneal sarcoma. It's called the STRAS-2 trial because there was a STRAS trial, which was a trial looking at radiation in patients with retroperitoneal sarcoma. That was a negative trial, but since that trial was done, there have been other chemotherapy agents that have shown a benefit in extremity sarcomas, and therefore investigators have felt that it's time to revisit this question. This is a randomized multi-center open label trial. It's actually an international trial. It was developed in Europe by the EORTC, which is the European Cooperative Group, and recently came over here and will be hopefully one of the first sites to open the trial. Patients will be randomized to either get surgery alone or an experimental arm of 3 cycles of neoadjuvant chemotherapy. The primary endpoint is disease-free survival. There are multiple secondary endpoints in this particular trial as well. This trial is only open to patients with high-risk dedifferentiated liposarcoma and leiomyosarcomas. They deliberately narrowed it down to 2 groups. These are the 2 most common groups that we see in this anatomical place, because one of the criticisms of the STRAS trial was the results were diluted with many different histologies. There are 50 different subtypes of soft tissue sarcomas. So going forward, many of the new sarcoma trials are going to focus on 1 or 2 of the subtypes. This is the study schema. Patients have to have either liposarcoma or leiomyosarcoma, and then they get randomized to either surgery within 4 weeks of randomization or chemotherapy within 2 weeks of randomization. The regimens are doxorubicin and ifosfamide for the liposarcoma and doxorubicin and dacarbazine for the leiomyosarcomas. And then after 3 cycles, they have to get surgery within 3 to 6 weeks of the final chemotherapy regimen. And this is the trial treatment. As I mentioned, the experimental arm is the chemotherapy with one of those 2 regimens. So that's where I'm going to end and hand it back to Dr. Bhatia.
Thank you, Dr. Deshpande. That was very concise, very helpful. I don't think we have any unanswered questions in the chat box. I can maybe wait a minute for anyone who has any questions. But if not, I think that brings us to the end of the session. And again, thank you very much, everyone, for attending.